Story. Fox News and Dominion Voting Systems agree a settlement worth nearly $800 million over claims about the rigging of the 2020 US election.
Fox has admitted to telling lies about Dominion that caused enormous damage to my company, our employees, and the customers that we serve.
Also tonight, the SNP in crisis after the Treasurer is arrested and then released over the party's funding and finances.
Does this threaten to derail what you're talking about here in Parliament this afternoon?
That certainly is not helpful, of course.
A US journalist jailed in Moscow is seen for the first time in court. His appeal against detention is rejected.
The charges against Evan are baseless, and we call on the Russian Federation to immediately release him.
The US, UK and Canadian ambassadors are summoned to the Russian Foreign Ministry, accused of gross interference. Just Stop Snooker. Tens of thousands of climate activists to demonstrate this weekend, as groups say they will continue with disruption. Tougher rules to stop energy suppliers forcing homeowners over 85 to switch to prepayment meters. But critics say the ban doesn't go far enough. Plus, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's coming up in our press preview from 10:30. Hello there, good evening. The voting machine company Dominion has settled with Fox News tonight for more than $787 million. It was announced less than an hour ago, just before both sides were due to deliver their opening statements in court. Dominion, which sells electronic voting hardware and software, had been suing Fox News Network over its coverage of false vote rigging claims in the 2020 US election. Our US correspondent Mark Stone joins us live now from outside the courthouse in Delaware. And Mark, Dominion exacting a heavy price for this out-of-court deal.
Yes, Fox will be paying $787.5 million to Dominion. This has been an extraordinary day of drama, of suspense, and at the heart of it, it is a story of truth, a story of lies, a story of an election, and a story of the most influential of all American cable news channels, Fox News. It went right to the wire, as you say. A little over half an hour or so ago, Dominion were out on the steps here at the courthouse in Wilmington, Delaware, where their voting machines company is headquartered, to announce that indeed a settlement had come. But it really went right to the wire. The trial was supposed to begin yesterday. Late on Sunday night, dramatically, the judge announced it would be delayed by a day. Was that to discuss a potential settlement? Well, it turns out it was. Today, the jury was sworn in. They were expecting 6 men, 6 women from here in Delaware, expecting to sit through 5 weeks of extraordinary legal drama. And at the end of it, they would come to the conclusion whether or not Fox had lied, whether it had knowingly broadcast stuff that was nonsense, that was not true. The hours went by, 2.5, almost 3 hours, and then the judge came into court and he said the two sides have settled. I then watched as Fox News's lawyers, Rupert Murdoch's chief lawyer, left through a side door, walked off up the street here in Wilmington. He and his colleagues said nothing, but at that moment a statement dropped into our inboxes, and I'll read a bit of it to you. It says, and this is a Fox statement, "We are pleased to have reached a settlement despite our dispute with Dominion Voting Systems. We acknowledge the court's rulings finding certain claims about Dominion to be false. This settlement reflects Fox's continued commitment to the highest journalistic standards. We are hopeful that our decision to resolve this dispute with Dominion amicably instead of acrimoniously instead of the acrimony of a divisive trial allows the country to move forward from these issues. So the figure, as I said, $787.5 million. That much will now be landing in the bank accounts of Dominion Voting Systems. An admission of guilt by Fox News. They say quite clearly certain claims about Dominion were false. What we don't yet know, Anna, is the detail. I imagine that will come out. There will be, I'm sure, lengthy statements that were shared between these two companies. That much will be fascinating to find how much Fox is claiming culpability for, how much Dominion was prepared to accept to allow this settlement to take place. As I said, on the steps outside the court here a few moments ago, we heard from the boss of Dominion. Have a listen.
Fox and Dominion have reached an historic settlement. Fox has admitted to telling lies about Dominion that caused enormous damage to my company, our employees, and the customers that we serve. Nothing can ever make up for that. Throughout this process, we have sought accountability and believe the evidence brought to light through this case underscores the consequences of spreading lies. Truthful reporting in the media is essential to our democracy.
A remarkable case then, Anna, that never was, a trial that never was. Of course, much of what Fox was up to has already been released, because in the pre-trial discovery period, as it's known, we learnt so much about the inner workings of the Fox newsroom. The bonnet was lifted on what they were really up to. Fascinating stuff, and I imagine the dust will take quite some time to settle.
Mark Stone updating us there from Wilmington in Delaware. Thank you. Well, this case, of course, came after Donald Trump's claims about vote rigging in 2020, and the former president has said he will run in the election next year. Today, former presidential candidate and US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton told Sky News she does not believe her former opponent, Donald Trump, can regain the presidency following his recent indictment. She was speaking to our political editor, Beth Rigby, in Belfast, where she's honouring women who contributed to the peace process in Northern Ireland as part of the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement.
Even if he gets the Republican nomination, he cannot, in my view, be re-elected president.
Why can't he be re-elected
because
if he gets the nomination?
I think people are, more people are on to him and his behavior than they were before. He has a hard core of support that is likely to help him win the Republican nomination. But in a general election against President Biden, I do not believe he can win.
To Scotland now, where a second person was arrested today over the Scottish National Party's funding and finances. Colin Beattie was detained by police for questioning this morning and this evening was released without charge pending further investigations. Former SNP chief executive and Nicola Sturgeon's husband, Peter Murrell, was arrested 2 weeks ago. It's over more than £600,000 raised for an independence referendum campaign. But today's arrest was bad timing for the new First Minister, Humza Yousaf, who was giving a speech in Parliament today. Sky Scotland correspondent Conor Gillis has this report.
Does this threaten to derail what you're talking about here in Parliament this afternoon?
It certainly is not helpful, of course.
The face of a First Minister fighting the flames of yet another fire.
Yeah, no, really difficult, really challenging. Of course, any new leader, any new First Minister doesn't want to have to be dealing with these challenges, but what I'm focused on is the priorities of the Scottish people.
Today, Humza Yousaf was hoping to reset his first major parliamentary speech, overshadowed amid the arrest of the SNP's treasurer. This was Colin Beattie arriving home after being detained by detectives for 12 hours. They are investigating the party's funding and finances. He was released without charge. There were no signs of police activity at Beattie's home while he was in custody. A veteran of the Scottish independence movement, someone who was treasurer for 16 years.
After so long at the helm, there was an internal SNP election in 2020. Colin Beattie was not re-elected to the post of Treasurer. However, his successor did not last long. He resigned, suggesting he did not have enough information to do the job properly. At that point, Colin Beattie returned to the job.
The party's never been in a stronger financial position than it is right now.
A leaked video of Nicola Sturgeon from 2021 in a meeting of the SNP's ruling body. Around the time police began investigating £600,000 raised for a second independence vote.
just be very careful, all of us, about suggestions that there are problems with the party's finances, because we depend on donors to donate. There are no reasons for people to be concerned about the party's finances, and all of us need to be careful about not suggesting that there is.
This is a difficult period for a party so dominant. There was a raid at the home of the former First Minister and her husband Peter Murrell on the day he was arrested, then released as part of the probe.
After 3 weeks, we already have a lame duck First Minister and a lame duck government, and that's not good for our country.
A moment too of difficulty for those who recently stood for the SNP top job.
I'm here in Parliament to talk about how the First Minister is going to tackle poverty, cost of living crisis, invest in our public sector and...
Obviously the party's engulfed in a crisis at the moment. What do you make of the party itself?
Certainly my focus will be on delivering for my constituents.
Do you think that the SNP is at risk of collapse?
No, I don't. I think obviously there are clearly concerns right now. It would be odd of me to stand here and say that everything's fine. Clearly that's not the case.
Unease and uncertainty in a political party enduring what has been described as its biggest crisis in 30 years. Conor Gillis, Sky News, Edinburgh.
And Conor joins us live now from Glasgow. So another arrest, Conor, and another difficult day for the new SNP leader.
Yeah, Humza Yousaf saying today he does not believe the SNP is operating in a criminal way. But yes, second arrest in as many weeks. Colin Beattie is not a big public figure. He's not in the high ranks of public office here in Scotland, but he is very senior within the SNP, as I was saying in my report. He also holds positions on Holyrood committees. There are calls tonight from opposition politicians for him to be suspended from those committees while this investigation continues at pace. Nicola Sturgeon, the former First Minister, was not in Holyrood today. She was wanting to give way to Humza Yousaf for his big moment to reset and talk about his priorities going forward. Well, clearly that did not happen due to this police investigation. I'm told a source close to her this evening has said that she will cooperate with any investigation going forward, but she has not been questioned as yet. What happens next with the police investigation? Well, clearly those detectives will be going over those interviews of Peter Murrell a number of weeks ago, and then clearly the SNP treasurer Colin Beattie, who was released without charge today, before deciding and plotting their next move.
Glasgow, thank you. The Wall Street Journal correspondent Evan Gershkovich will stay in prison in Moscow and await trial after losing his appeal to be released. It was the first time we've seen the journalist since he was arrested. Soon after he appeared in court, the Russian Foreign Ministry summoned the UK, US and Canadian ambassadors who've been accused of interfering in Russian affairs. Sky's international correspondent John Sparks has the story.
Evan Gershkovich has spent 6 years in Russia reporting on the news. Now he is the news after the authorities arrested him for spying. This, the first time he's been seen publicly since the end of March, like an exhibit in a glass cabinet within a Moscow courtroom. His lawyers applied for bail while the authorities assemble their case. But Gershkovich knew his chances were slim. Gershkovich's arrest was trumpeted on state television. The host of this talk show said he was trying to obtain classified information about an arms factory. The enterprise, a total failure, she says. But the Americans call his detention totally illegal. The ambassador in the blue jacket casting a disapproving eye. After his plea for bail was denied, she made her displeasure known.
The charges against Evan are baseless, and we call on the Russian Federation to immediately release him.
Such comments have infuriated the Russians. Here, the British ambassador exits the foreign ministry after a diplomatic dressing down. She and her American counterpart accused of interfering in the legal process. Criticism of President Putin's administration and invasion is unwelcome. Here, solitary protests against the war in Ukraine are quashed by police, and reporters must be careful what they say. But some analysts think there's another reason the American was arrested.
It's the Kremlin's intention to create a pool of hostages in order to bargain with the United States about some Russians who was detained in different Western countries.
Disputes and prisoner swaps form part of the conflict, but the fighting continues in occupied Ukraine, and the Russian leader made a rare visit, speaking to commanders in the region of Kherson and Luhansk. I'm here to listen to your opinion, he said, somewhat unconvincingly. His spokesman told Sky News, "You now see the leader visiting the regions more often." That may be essential, as some Russians question his leadership, their commander-in-chief unable to win the war. John Sparks, Sky News.
Extinction Rebellion and other climate action groups have vowed to continue protests unless the government meets their demands. Up to 28,000 people are expected to attend a mass demonstration this weekend at the same time as the London Marathon. But event organisers say they've had reassurances the marathon will not be disrupted. Our climate change and energy correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter reports.
An activist from the Just Stop Oil climate protest group disrupting the World Snooker Championships in Sheffield. Part of a dramatic evening in which another activist succeeded in stopping the game altogether. Now, Just Stop Oil says there's more to come.
The disruption will continue. There's millions of eyeballs on the snooker, so we've initiated millions of conversations.
They're not actually discussing the climate crisis now. They're discussing how annoying the protest was.
The really disruptive action is the only mechanism that normal people have available to us in order to force the necessary social change. Now, the junior doctors know that, the nurses know that, the train drivers know that. Open a history book. Every major social development has been won by a small minority who are highly unpopular at the time.
Unpopular, say critics, but also potentially counterproductive.
I think a lot of people will see disrupting sporting or other events that have absolutely nothing to do with climate change as nothing more than attention seeking.
Perhaps that's why protest group Extinction Rebellion is trying a slightly different tactic this weekend, joining other groups in coalition and descending on Westminster for 4 days of peaceful protest they are calling the big one. They've recently pulled back from their old ways of doing things, but warn that won't last forever.
The government has until 5 p.m. on Monday, the 24th of April, to agree to enter negotiation. If we don't get a response, at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, 25th of April, Extinction Rebellion will build an unprecedented coalition, stepping up our campaigns in the weeks and months ahead.
This now seems likely, as their demands, especially stopping new oil and gas, are optimistic.
Despite the expected presence of tens of thousands of protesters around Parliament in the coming days, the government's very unlikely to agree to what is being asked. In fact, it's expanding oil and gas drilling in the North Sea and says we will need fossil fuels, however unpopular, for decades to come.
It sets the scene for a spring and summer of protest, headline-grabbing and deeply divisive. Hannah Thomas-Peter, Sky News.
One woman told Sky News that she felt like she'd been burgled after energy firm workers forced their way into her home to install a meter. Energy companies have agreed to an outright ban on the forced installation of prepayment meters for people over the age of 85 and those who are terminally ill. The new measures were called for after contractors working for British Gas were filmed breaking into vulnerable households to install the meters. Well, there are currently around 4 million prepayment meters installed around the country, with customers paying around 6% more than those without. The new code of practice bans the forced installation of prepayment meters for the over 85s, the terminally ill and those who need continuous power for health reasons. Suppliers have now agreed to attempt to contact a customer at least 10 times and perform a site welfare visit before installing the meters. Plus, body cameras or audio recorders must be worn during installations and welfare visits. Sky's Becky Johnson reports.
These are workers from an energy company calling at the home of a customer who owed money. Their aim was to get in and force the installation of a prepayment meter. After a few minutes, they started to drill through the door. The owner of the house in Birmingham was at work at the time. She agreed to speak to us, but wanted us to protect her identity.
It felt as though I'd been burgled. I felt unsafe. It just didn't make any sense to me as to why they needed to take that action. I was corresponding with them.
Due to problems with the wiring, they couldn't fit the meter, but left a note warning they'd be back. This family in London did have one fitted while they were out.
I literally had a panic attack. The neighbours actually came downstairs and they actually came in. They heard me crying, they heard me being upset. My mom didn't know what was going on. She's 90 years old, so she just saw me wandering around the flat hysterical.
Enforced installations of prepayment meters were paused earlier this year. After this, undercover footage caused outrage.
Exciting bit, I love this bit. Which bit? This bit, I love this bit. But if they're just saying, oh, I'm a single mum and I got 3 kids, and that's not vulnerability.
It led to calls for the practice to be banned altogether. And charities say the new rules that only restrict forced installations don't protect enough people.
Well, they've obviously picked 85 plus because it's the smallest group and they want to maximise the number of people that they can impose prepayment meters on. Yes, it's great that those few people are protected, but that's a tiny tip of the iceberg of the size of the issue.
The chief executive of Ofgem said it must be as a last resort, and customers in vulnerable situations will be given the extra care and consideration they deserve over and above the rules already in place by suppliers, something that has clearly not always been happening. But by stopping short of a ban, more families will find their homes are targeted if they fall behind on their bills. Becky Johnson, Sky News, Birmingham.
An 84-year-old man charged with first-degree assault after shooting a black teenager in the head and arm has surrendered to police in Missouri. Ralph Yarl was shot by Andrew Lester after reportedly going to the wrong house to pick up his younger twin brothers. After initially being detained, Lester was released by police, sparking protests throughout Kansas City over the weekend. Our US correspondent James Matthews reports.
Ralph Yarl is the 16-year-old who went to the wrong door and almost paid for it with his life. He'd been sent to pick up his 2 younger brothers and mistakenly went to this house, home of 84-year-old Andrew Lester. According to police documents, he says he thought Ralph was breaking in when he answered the doorbell. Immediately, he fired a handgun through a glass door. Ralph was shot in the head. He told police that when he fell, he was hit a second time in his arm. He ran to neighbours and received help. Not before one told him to lie down with his hands in the air, according to a family lawyer.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!
There had been protests after the man who fired the shot was released after less than 2 hours of police questioning. He's since been charged with 2 crimes, including assault. Prosecutors speak of a racial component to the shooting. Ralph hadn't gone to 115th Terrace, where his brothers were in Kansas City. He went to an address at 115th Street, around the corner. It was a near-fatal mistake.
He went and rang the doorbell, and he was supposed to stay outside, and his brothers were supposed to run outside, get in the car, and they come home. And that was what was supposed to happen. And while he was standing there, his brothers didn't run outside, but he got a couple of bullets in his body instead of a couple of twins coming up out and giving him a hug.
And the case has turned heads in Hollywood. Actor Halle Berry shared a thread on Twitter saying she was sick and tired of this feeling and that her heart completely broke when she heard the news. Viola Davis posted a series of pictures on her Instagram feed and called for charges to be brought against the man who fired the gun. The incident may test Missouri's so-called Stand Your Ground law, which allows for deadly force in response to a serious threat. A serious question would surround the threat posed by a boy picking up his brothers. James Matthews, Sky News, in Washington.
Well, some breaking news tonight. A multi-storey car park has partially collapsed in New York's Manhattan Financial District. Pictures appear to show the third floor of the building collapsing onto the second, with reports of several people trapped and at least 3 people injured. New York City Mayor Eric Adams is heading to the scene in Lower Manhattan. These are the latest pictures for you. Elsewhere, more breaking news. At least 4 people have been severely injured in a stabbing at a gym in the western German city of Duisburg. Police have asked residents to avoid the area. No arrests were announced, and the motive of the attack is not immediately clear. The former Conservative Cabinet Minister David Davis has warned hundreds of thousands of people could be denied their right to vote unless new compulsory voter ID rules in England are delayed. Our political correspondent Liz Bates has been speaking to young people in Hull who will have to show ID to vote for the first time in next month's local elections.
200 miles from Westminster, decisions made there are making waves here, the port city of Hull. As new rules requiring voters to show ID for the first time in England come into force for May's local elections. At this youth centre, they fear the changes will exclude the city's vulnerable voters.
It's just another obstacle to people from underprivileged backgrounds or from marginalised communities to vote. For me personally, I've never voted. It's just making it a barrier, and we have enough barriers already.
Those without valid ID, like a passport or driver's licence, can apply for free ID online. But the uptake has been low.
Do you know how to access free voter ID if you need it?
No. I had to ask my nana to help me do a voting paperwork. And it's like because I didn't know big words or how to fill one in.
Disproportionately affected are the unemployed, the elderly, those on benefits and in rented housing, making deprived regions more vulnerable.
Hull is one of the areas where voters are less likely to have a valid form of ID. But up and down the country, there are huge numbers of people without one, up to 3.5 million. Many of them unaware that they could be turned away next time they try to vote.
It does rather beg the question.
In Westminster, though, the government is determined to press ahead.
I think in order to have absolute confidence in the ballot, I think saying you need some form of ID in order to vote in person on the day is a reasonable thing to request.
They say a similar system has been used in Northern Ireland since 2003, and the changes are needed to stop electoral fraud. This is despite just one case across all UK elections last year. And now, former Minister David Davis is leading calls for a rethink.
I would at very least just delay it. If they do that, at least it avoids the worst outcome, which is that thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people are prevented from voting.
Back in Hull, they're preparing for what they call their youth parliament. Held every 2 weeks, it's a forum where they can be heard. But beyond the safety of the youth centre and in light of these new voting rules, they feel more ignored by those in power than ever. Liz Bates, Sky News, Hull.
Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview, including this story on the front of the Scotsman. Their headline, the S&P crisis deepens, they say, after a second arrest. More on that and other stories, of course, to come. Tonight, we're joined by Sonia Soda, chief leader writer at The Observer, and Mark Wallace, chief executive of the Total Politics Group. Back in just a moment.